Hello, welcome to FinTrail's FinCrime Spotlight. Ciara and James with you today. So last week, the FCA released its business plan for the next 12 months, which outlines their priorities, which is out of the second year of their 3-year strategy. Overarching from that strategy, there are key 3 strategic themes the FCA have set out: reducing and preventing serious harm, setting and testing higher standards, and promoting competition and positive change. So the plan for this year outlines 4 areas of focus for the next 12 months. And these are the areas that they're planning to provide further investment in and increase resources. So they are putting consumers' needs first, with consumer duty being a key driving force of this, particularly I think important as we're in this cost of living crisis. The second one being preparing financial services for the future and really looking at delivering the outcomes of Edinburgh reforms and the new future regulatory framework that has been set out, so they can look at addressing emerging harms more efficiently. Thirdly, strengthening the UK's position in the global wholesale markets, looking to encourage competition and being seen as a global market of choice. And I think, as we've seen with sort of recent market events, being able to respond to some volatility we've seen as a result of like Credit Suisse, SVB over the past couple of weeks. And then finally, reducing and preventing financial crime. So really looking at how they can protect their consumers, and especially those that are in vulnerable circumstances and maybe more susceptible to fraud. That all dovetails back into putting consumer needs first. So some very key areas, and I think it's an important sort of document to acknowledge where their focus will be over the next 12 months.
And they do outline some key focus areas on how they obviously want to achieve this, all very high level stuff. The first being a reasonably simple one, which is grow headcount. Which they are obviously underway at the moment on that particular area. Obviously, the other bit, as you mentioned as well, Ciara, I think, was becoming a data-led regulator. So I think they've identified some internal weaknesses in terms of how they are maturing as a supervisory authority. So ensuring they are, I guess, doing some of those upgrades in their intelligence capabilities and kind of how they approach and become a more data-led kind of as supervisor as well. Also working with additional partners, and they've also called out, including smaller firms, so not just focusing on those bigger businesses. They're very much aware that those smaller businesses are part of the ecosystem as well, so they're quoting being committed to kind of building out their partnerships there as well. And then focusing on crypto, as you'd expect. Don't necessarily need to elaborate hugely on there, but ultimately building out their crypto kind of knowledge within the business. I think, recently they've had lots of contractors, I think, internally at the FCA to focus on crypto authorizations and supervision. So I think ensuring they've got maybe some full-time employees kind of managing that part as it's continuing to not go away. So crypto, another focus area there.
Yeah, and I think as they sort of set it all against the backdrop of the sort of changing environment we're in, and particularly with rising costs and the cost of living crisis. And I think that dovetails into the 4th focus area for them, which I think is one for us to focus on, reducing and preventing financial crime. Like specifically on this area, I think the outcomes the FCA want to achieve are, I think, inevitably, given where we are in terms of the ecosystem at the minute, some of them are very fraud focused. So looking at slowing the growth in investment fraud from victims and from a loss perspective. And they talk about a lot of the educational campaigns that they're going to use to do this. Some of the tools that they have through their register to reduce the volume of fraud that is being seen. Particularly then, I think, looking at authorised push payment fraud cases and the losses associated with that. Obviously, there's a lot of work going on with the PSR on this over the last few years. And I think in the FCA rightly calls out in the plan that it's very much dependent on sort of the efforts of everyone in the ecosystem to support this. So the National Economic Crime Strategy, the plan that we've seen come out recently, and I think the dependency probably looking forward on the upcoming impending fraud strategy whenever we see that delivered, because in isolation the FCA can't do sort of reduce the growth in APP and investment fraud. So there'll be many dependencies and other players in this area. So I think it's sort of the key focuses for them, but sort of looking at how they engage sort of more broadly on it. And then money laundering as well. And I think when we look at money laundering, I think it's sort of how they call out how they supervise firms and improving the effectiveness of supervisions, particularly when we look at the professional body supervisors that exist as well. And I think for me, when I looked at it, and it doesn't sit directly in the money laundering section, but what they talk about is investing and raising standards in authorised firms to improve their abilities to detect and prevent financial crimes. And I think part of this is looking at the oversight of appointed representatives is an area that firms should be aware of. So the FCA want to sort of strengthen scrutiny at the regulatory gateway, as they say, and improve the engagement with principal firms, particularly when they're appointing authorised representatives, and making sure there's a more robust authorization application process by principal firms. So, and I think when we've seen the consultation as well that they put out recently, we'll probably look to see strengthened roles and responsibilities coming in from principals from an authorization perspective. So I think that's a key area, sort of more broadly than fraud. We probably will see more focus from in the FCA this year. But I think, James, is probably worth touching on fraud and crypto, because it is a very big area for them.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we're seeing obviously some themes coming out of the Dear CEO letters as well. But, crypto as well as fraud being focus area, particularly on the financial crime side of things. And they actually split out their, I guess, how they are going to achieve them and the outcomes into, I guess, a stretch target and a target, both in which they're saying 23, 24 in terms of the next year or 2 years. So, that they've got 3 particular areas that they want to commit to, I think, this year. And then if they've got time, they might do the rest of this year and going on to next year as well. So, and for this year, or is in terms of what they're going to start this year, they call out an increased volume of proactive assessment on firms. So I think we're seeing that increase already. So I guess, keep an eye out for, the FCA coming knocking for particular thematic reviews on different areas, but also, again, continuing the theme of being a data-led, I guess, supervisor. They call out the use of additional analytics tools for more broader AML purposes from a supervision perspective, but also on the fraud lens, having a more data-led approach to understanding which particular firms they supervise may be more susceptible to fraud as well, so they can, have a bigger focus on those particular organisations. And then going on to the items they are going to continue in the 23 and 24, depending on time and capacity allowing. I think there's a few other bits specifically on data. So I think, Ciara, you mentioned on taking a stronger approach to testing and financial controls in the gateway, which they call out. I think the sanctions bit is also another area they're looking at developing. So having a more robust way of testing sanctions, specifically in the firms they supervise. Evaluating how they are protecting consumers. So that's another area that is not just FCA driven, but wider driven by some of the government and things that we're looking at the moment, and specifically in the economic crime plan as well. And I think just generally better supervision of crypto firms as well is just a commitment they're looking at more broadly going forward as well.
Yeah, and I think it probably goes back to sort of putting in sort of more resources and the appropriate expertise into certain functions, particularly as they look at that life cycle of the authorizations, the supervision, and then the enforcement actions that we're seeing. I think it probably looks that we'll see a more activity from the FCA over the next 12 months across those pillars, and I think it's one that firms should be mindful of as well.
But not just more activity in the proactive assessments, it's probably the nature of the those proactive assessments as well. So I think we've all been subject to them at some point questioning just general workshops, policy submissions, but actually probably what we're going to see over the course of the next 1 to 2 years is actually more data-led scrutiny, and more kind of data-led and system-led kind of scrutiny in those assessments as well. So very much one to keep in mind when you're kind of going into those sessions as well.
And I think it's also is like given the fact that they're being a lot more vocal now on fraud, I think this is going to be certainly and very clearly in this plan as a key area for them, because
Yeah.
I think that really goes back to the consumer impact of it, and that's where it's being a lot of direct pain is being felt at an individual and firm level for as a result of fraud. So I think that data-led supervision will certainly be seen in terms of where they're seeing fraud losses, fraud reports as well. So I think that's probably, and we've seen that from the recent, as you said, Dear CEO letter too, where they're expecting more active oversight of fraud control. So I think that is probably sort of highlights the direction. And then quite timely then, like we've seen, obviously it's worth mentioning just on the topic of fraud, we've seen the UK government release their intentions for the failure to prevent fraud offence. So similar to the corporate offence of tax evasion released a few years ago. So very much looking at targeting employee fraud and companies profiting from that. So I think that it certainly is, we're seeing the screws being tightened in terms of expectations of firms in terms of managing their own internal fraud risk, but then what that means again for managing the how that impacts then underlying consumers as well too. So I think this will certainly look at sort of driving that culture change around fraud prevention, and then how hold organisations to account if they're looking at sort of fraudulent activities of their employees as well.
Yes, and yeah, very interesting to see how that one develops. I think if we follow some of the pieces from the Criminal Finances Act for the corporate offence, excuse me, I think it was do a risk assessment, make sure you've got accurate policies and procedures, terms of reference. So you know, we'll see what happens on there on this particular aspect as well. But I think there was more to it than in the breaking the chain kind of piece that the government released as well last year. And obviously this particular corporate offence was one of those recommendations that were featured in there, and there were some other bits you know, that were the suggested recommendations that maybe we could just quickly highlight. So that was suggestions to the PSR to slow down faster payments, which is a really interesting one. You know, we want faster payments, but you know, do we want faster payments all the time? So not all faster payments, just what they would classify as higher risk ones. Making fraud a priority in law enforcement. Recalibrating all the different subcommittees of who's accountable for fraud was another one. You know, there's lots of different departments. I think they called it the alphabet soup of departments or something in the report itself. The corporate offence we referenced, that's moving forward. Pushing the online safety bill, the very well documented online safety bill that is going to resolve all problems in the UK. Probably not, but it's progress nonetheless. And then finally, a central government campaign for fraud, which I guess we will probably see at some point. So more an education piece for the consumer.
Yeah, so I think a lot of important initiatives happening, and I think certainly we're seeing a lot of alignment of expectations now with the economic crime plan, with the FCA strategy and where they're focusing on, and where the expectation will be of firms, whether they're regulated or not. But I think particularly if we're looking at this FCA plan, what the expectations will be of regulated firms over the coming years. I don't think this is going to change dramatically, but I think certainly if you haven't got the time to read it, it's good to be aware of some of those priorities being called out in this plan. Brilliant. Well, I think that covers most of it today, James, so we'll call it there. But thanks again, and thanks for everyone listening in. Cheers.